Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Beatrice Vance laughed as she poured the wine over Elena Vance's scrubs in front of the Gala committee. The deep crimson liquid blossomed across the pale blue cotton, soaking through to Elena's skin with a startling, icy bite. The scent of expensive Bordeaux and lilies filled the solarium, clashing with the sterile smell of the hospital that still clung to Elena's hair. "Oh, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice a practiced trill of mock sympathy. She didn't look sorry. Her eyes, sharp as flint, danced with a cruel light. "I didn't see you standing there. But then, you do have a way of blending into the furniture in those hideous rags." The three women seated around the wrought iron table exchanged knowing glances. They were the pillars of the city's social elite, women who measured worth in thread counts and zip codes. One of them hid a smirk behind a manicured hand, while another pointedly adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet, the gems catching the afternoon sun. Elena didn't move. She felt the heavy, wet fabric of her uniform clinging to her chest, a stark contrast to the shimmering silk of her stepmother's designer dress. She had just finished a 16-hour shift at the oncology ward, her feet aching and her mind heavy with the weight of patients who wouldn't see the weekend. Coming home to the Vance estate was supposed to be a reprieve, not a battlefield. "It's a vintage blend, dear," Beatrice continued, her designer heels clicking sharply on the Italian marble as she circled Elena. "Probably costs more than your monthly salary at that. Little clinic, do try to be more careful, you're staining the floor." "I was just going to check on my father," Elena said. Her voice was level, devoid of the tears Beatrice so clearly craved. She kept her gaze steady, observing the fine lines of malice around the older woman's mouth. "Julian is resting," Beatrice snapped, her tone shifting from playful to predatory in a heartbeat. "And he doesn't need his nurse daughter hovering over him. It's embarrassing, Elena. The neighbors are starting to ask why a Vance is emptying bedpans for a living. It's a disgrace to the name." From the shadows of the arched doorway, Marcus Vance stepped forward. He looked disheveled, his expensive linen shirt wrinkled at the collar, a frantic energy behind his eyes that Elena recognized all too well. He didn't look at his sister. His focus was entirely on the woman holding the wine bottle. "Mother, the accounts are," Marcus started, then stopped, noticing the committee. He cleared his throat, forcing a jagged smile. "Elena, you're home late and wet." "Your sister was just being clumsy, Marcus," Beatrice said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. She turned back to Elena, leaning in close enough that the cloying scent of her perfume made Elena's stomach turn. "Since you're so fond of service, why don't you go find Mrs. Gable and help her with the hors d'oeuvres? You're clearly not dressed for the company I keep." Elena felt the familiar heat of indignation rising in her throat, but she suppressed it. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her damp scrubs. Her fingers brushed against a small, cold object, a digital recorder she had used for patient notes, currently active and tucked away. She had turned it on the moment she heard Beatrice's voice from the hallway. "I'll go change," Elena said quietly. "Do more than that," Beatrice called out as Elena turned to leave. "Move your things to the servants' wing." "I'm turning your suite into a walk-in closet for Marcus's new season wardrobe. You don't belong in the main house anymore, Elena. You haven't for a long time." The committee ladies broke into soft, tittering laughter. The sound followed Elena like a physical weight as she walked toward the grand staircase. She passed Mrs. Gable, who stood near the kitchen entrance with a silver tray. The older woman's eyes were full of a quiet, helpless fury on Elena's behalf, her knuckles white against the metal. Elena gave her a microscopic nod, a silent promise. Upstairs, in the dim light of the hallway, Elena stopped outside her father's room. She could hear Julian Vance's labored breathing through the heavy oak door. He was the man who had built this empire, now a prisoner of his own failing body, and the woman who controlled his medication. Elena looked down at the wine stain on her chest. It looked like a wound. She pulled the recorder from her pocket and hit the stop button. She didn't need to play it back to know she had every word of Beatrice's verbal assault, every mocking laugh from the committee, and the clear evidence of Marcus's anxiety over the accounts. She went to her room, the room Beatrice intended to strip away, and locked the door. She didn't cry. Instead, she sat at her desk and pulled a hidden floorboard loose. Inside was a folder of documents she had been quietly assembling for months. Julian's original will, the one Beatrice thought she had destroyed, and a set of financial records that didn't match the ones Marcus was showing the board. Beatrice thought she was casting out a servant. She didn't realize she was finally waking the lion. Elena pulled out a clean set of clothes, her movements deliberate and cold. She looked at the calendar on her wall. The Vance anniversary gala was in exactly 3 days. The entire city would be there to witness the family's supposed unity. 3 days, Elena whispered to the empty room. She touched the recorder, the plastic casing still warm from her pocket. Beatrice wanted a show. She wanted to treat the Vance name like a weapon. Fine, Elena would let her. But by the time the gala ended, the only thing Beatrice Vance would be wearing was the consequences of her own arrogance. The game hadn't just changed, it had begun. Elena reached for her phone and dialed a number she had kept in her contacts for years, one she had never intended to use until this very moment. "It's Elena," she said when the line picked up. "I'm ready to talk about the audit." The next morning, the fog clung to the manicured hedges of the Vance estate like a damp shroud. Elena Vance stood at the service entrance, her fingers numb against the cold iron of the gate. She wasn't here to beg for her position back. She was here for the small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards of the servants' quarters, the only thing her mother had left her. "Still lurking, Elena." Beatrice Vance appeared on the gravel path, her silk robe fluttering in the morning breeze. She didn't look like a woman who had just upended a life. She looked like a queen surveying a minor nuisance. She held a porcelain cup, the steam carrying the sharp, floral scent of Earl Grey into the chilly air. "I'm here for my belongings, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice a flat, steady line. Beatrice laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Your belongings? Everything in that room was purchased with Vance money. The clothes, the bed, the very air you breathed. You leave with what you brought, nothing." She stepped closer, the smell of her expensive rose perfume clashing with the damp earth. "I've already had Mrs. Gable clear it out. The trash collectors should be arriving any minute." Elena's pulse hammered against her throat, but she didn't flinch. She saw Marcus Vance leaning against the heavy oak front door, checking his gold watch. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, the telltale signs of a night spent at the underground high-stakes tables. "Let her in, Mother," Marcus called out, his voice dripping with boredom. "She's an eyesore standing there. The neighbors will think we're running a charity ward." He sauntered down the path, his designer loafers clicking rhythmically on the stones. He stopped inches from Elena, the scent of stale whiskey and expensive peppermint gum radiating from him. "Tell you what, Elena, I'll let you grab your trinkets if you sign this." He held out a single sheet of paper. It was a non-disclosure agreement, drafted with predatory precision. $100,000 to disappear, Marcus whispered, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, hungry greed. "Think of how many shifts you won't have to pull at the hospital. Just sign, take the cash, and forget you ever knew the Vance name." Elena looked at the paper, then at the man who had once called her a sister. He needed that signature to clear the path for the inheritance he'd already gambled away. He was terrified of an audit, even if he didn't yet realize she held the match that would light the fire. "My silence isn't for sale, Marcus," Elena said. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the smooth, cold casing of her phone. She felt the weight of the digital files she'd already secured, the proof of the systematic embezzlement Marcus had used to cover his mounting debts. "And neither is my dignity." Beatrice's face contorted, the mask of elegance slipping to reveal the jagged cruelty beneath. "Dignity? You're a parasite. You've spent years leeching off Julian's guilt, but Julian Vance is sedated and I am the one holding the keys now." She turned to her son. "Don't offer her a cent, let her rot. We have a gala to prepare for." "The anniversary gala," Elena murmured. 3 days away. 3 days until the world sees the Vance family in its full glory, Beatrice snapped. "And you will be a footnote in a history book that's already been burned." Beatrice turned her back, her heels crunching on the gravel as she led Marcus back toward the house. They didn't see Elena pull out her phone. They didn't see her hit send on an encrypted message to Dr. Eris Thorne. Elena watched them go, the cold iron of the gate no longer feeling like a barrier, but a cage she had finally escaped. She knew what was in the audit. She knew about the offshore accounts Beatrice had opened in Julian's name without his knowledge. "Enjoy the preparations, Beatrice," Elena whispered to the wind. "Make sure the champagne is vintage. It's the last thing you'll ever taste on the Vance tab." She turned away from the estate, her walk brisk and purposeful. As she reached the end of the drive, her phone buzzed. A message from Eris. "The discrepancy in the medical wing funds is larger than we thought. Julian's signature was forged on every transfer. I have the originals." Elena felt a grim satisfaction settle in her chest. The roots of the Vance empire were rotting, and she was the one holding the shovel. The countdown had officially begun. 48 hours had passed since the heavy iron gates of the Vance estate had hissed shut behind Elena Vance, yet the chill of that place seemed to cling to her skin like a second shadow. The morning sun through the windows of the private clinic was bright, but it lacked warmth as she stood in the sterile quiet of the hallway. The air here smelled of ozone and industrial-grade lavender, a sharp contrast to the suffocating scent of lilies that Beatrice Vance favored. Dr. Eris Thorne was waiting in his office, the blinds drawn tight against the street-level traffic. He didn't offer a greeting when she entered. Instead, he slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. His face was a mask of professional exhaustion, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, genuine fear. Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, textured grain of the heavy bond paper. She opened the file. Inside were the original requisitions for the medical wings equipment, ventilators, dialysis machines, and specialized beds that had never actually arrived. At the bottom of each page was a signature that purported to be from Julian Vance. "Look at the V," Eris whispered, leaning forward. "Your father has had a slight tremor in his right hand for 3 years. It's subtle, but it's there in every genuine document he signs. These signatures are too smooth, too perfect. They were traced, Elena." She traced the ink with her thumb. It was a cold, calculated betrayal. While her father lay in that house, his mind slipping away, his wife was using his name to gut the very legacy he had spent 40 years building. "There's more," Eris continued, his voice dropping an octave. "I tracked the wire transfers for the maintenance fees. They weren't going to a contractor. They were being routed through a shell company called BV Holdings. The primary beneficiary is an offshore account in the Caymans. I have the bank routing numbers, but I can't get the names without a subpoena." "You won't need one," Elena said, her voice steady. She tucked the folder into her bag, the weight of it feeling like a loaded weapon. "Beatrice is too arrogant to think anyone would ever look. She thinks she's untouchable because she's a Vance by marriage." The sound of sharp, rhythmic clicks echoed from the linoleum hallway outside. Elena froze. She knew that sound. It was the predatory strike of designer stilettos, a sound that usually preceded a storm. The office door swung open without a knock. Beatrice Vance stood in the threshold, her silhouette framed by the bright fluorescent lights of the corridor. She was draped in a cream-colored wool coat that probably cost more than a nurse's annual salary, her gloved hand clutching a limited edition Hermes bag. "I knew I'd find the two of you huddled together like rats in a storm drain," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with a practiced, melodic contempt. She didn't look at the office. She looked through it, as if the very walls were beneath her notice. Eris stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Beatrice, this is a private consultation." "Oh, spare me the professional theatrics, Eris," she snapped, stepping into the room. The scent of her jasmine perfume flooded the small space, cloying and thick. She turned her gaze to Elena, her eyes raking over her stepdaughter's modest blazer and jeans with visible disgust. "And you, I thought I made it clear that your presence was no longer required or tolerated." Elena didn't flinch. She kept her hand resting on the bag containing the evidence. "I was just leaving. I came to collect some of my father's personal medical records." Beatrice let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Records? You're a nurse, Elena, not a doctor. Your input is about as valuable as the dirt on my shoes. You've always had these delusions of grandeur, haven't you? Thinking you could just slide back into this family and play the devoted daughter. She stepped closer, invading Elena's personal space. Let me be very clear. Julian belongs to me. This legacy belongs to me. And if I catch you sniffing around my husband's affairs again, I won't just have you barred from the estate. I'll ensure your nursing license is revoked before the sun sets. Is that a threat, Beatrice? Elena asked quietly. It's a promise, Beatrice hissed, her face contorting for a brief second, revealing the jagged edge of her greed. And as for that meddlesome old crow, Mrs. Gable, I've already had the locks changed on the servants' quarters. She's currently packing her bags. It turns out her pension was never actually codified in the estate's bylaws. She'll be out on the street by nightfall. The blood in Elena's veins turned to ice. Mrs. Gable had served the Vance family for 30 years. She was the only person who had shown Elena a shred of kindness after her mother died. She has nowhere to go, Elena said, her voice trembling with a rage she struggled to contain. Then I suggest she finds a very comfortable park bench, Beatrice replied, adjusting her glove with casual indifference. Now, get out, both of you. Eris, expect a call from my lawyers regarding your contract. You're finished. Beatrice turned on her heel, her exit as dramatic as her entrance. She didn't look back, her confidence so absolute that she didn't even notice the folder tucked under Elena's arm. Elena watched her go, her knuckles white as she gripped the strap of her bag. The arrogance was a shield, but it was also a blindfold. Beatrice was so busy looking down at everyone that she failed to see the ground crumbling beneath her feet. She's going to destroy everything, Eris whispered, his face pale. No, Elena said, turning to him. Her eyes were hard, the last remnants of her hesitation burned away by the thought of Mrs. Gable being cast out. She's going to throw a party. The Vance Foundation's annual gala is in 48 hours. Every donor, every board member, and every journalist in the city will be there to watch her receive her Philanthropist of the Year award. She looked down at the folder, the forged signatures, the offshore accounts, the evidence of a life built on the bones of a dying man's empire. 2 days, Eris, Elena said, her voice a cold, sharp promise. In 2 days, the world is going to see exactly what Beatrice Vance is made of. Make sure the originals are backed up. I'm going to find Mrs. Gable. She walked out of the clinic, her pace brisk and purposeful. The countdown had moved from days to hours. Beatrice wanted a show, and Elena was going to give her one she would never forget. The morning before the Vance Foundation Gala, the air in the estate's grand foyer was thick with the cloying scent of 3,000 white lilies. Elena stood on the checkered marble, watching a small army of caterers polish silver that already shone with a predatory gleam. She felt the weight of the digital drive in her pocket, a small, cold rectangle that contained the power to turn this house of cards into a funeral pyre. Beatrice Vance stood at the center of the chaos, her voice cutting through the clatter of crystal like a shard of glass. She was draped in a silk robe that cost more than a year of Elena's salary at the clinic, her eyes scanning the room for imperfections. When she spotted Elena, her expression didn't shift into surprise. It curdled into a familiar, practiced contempt. The service entrance is around the corner, Elena, Beatrice said, not even looking up from her clipboard. And unless you've brought the jewelry you stole from your father's safe, I have no use for you today. Elena didn't flinch. She'd spent years letting these barbs draw blood, but today she felt like she was wearing armor made of truth. I'm not here for the silver, Beatrice. I'm here to see Julian. Your father is resting, Beatrice snapped, finally meeting her gaze. The older woman stepped closer, the sharp scent of her designer perfume, something floral and aggressive, filling the space between them. He's had a difficult week. Seeing his disappointment of a daughter would likely be the end of him. Besides, Marcus is with him, a son who actually understands the value of this family's legacy. Elena glanced toward the grand staircase. Marcus Vance was leaning against the mahogany railing, his face unnaturally pale. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring at his phone, his thumb twitching in a frantic rhythm. The gambling debts Elena had uncovered in the offshore ledgers were clearly weighing on him. He looked less like a favored son and more like a man waiting for the floor to drop out from under him. "Legacy is a funny word," Elena said, her voice low and steady. "It's usually built on something solid. But I've been looking into the Foundation's books, Beatrice. It seems the Vance legacy is currently being held together by forged signatures and redirected donor funds." The silence that followed was heavy. A caterer nearby stopped polishing a tray, his eyes darting toward them before quickly looking away. Beatrice's hand tightened on her clipboard until her knuckles turned a porcelain white. For a fleeting second, a flicker of genuine fear crossed her eyes, but she smothered it beneath a layer of icy arrogance. "You always were a creative storyteller," Beatrice sneered, stepping even closer until she was inches from Elena's face. "But nobody listens to a nurse with a grudge. Tomorrow night, I will be standing on a stage in front of every influential person in this city. I will be the philanthropist of the year. And you'll be exactly where you belong, in the gutter, wondering why you ever thought you could challenge me." Beatrice turned to a passing servant. "Mrs. Gable, get this woman out of my sight. She's tracking mud onto the marble." Mrs. Gable appeared from the shadows of the dining room. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but as she approached Elena, her hand brushed against Elena's arm. It was a quick, firm squeeze, a silent signal of solidarity. "This way, Miss Elena," Mrs. Gable said softly. Elena allowed herself to be led toward the door, but she stopped at the threshold. She looked back at Beatrice, who was already barking orders at a florist. The arrogance was back, thick and suffocating. Beatrice truly believed she was untouchable. "Enjoy the flowers, Beatrice," Elena called out, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "They're beautiful. It's a shame they'll be wilted by tomorrow night." Beatrice didn't even turn around. She simply waved a dismissive hand as if shooing a fly. Outside, the sun was bright, but Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She pulled out her phone and dialed Eris. "It's done," she said when he picked up. "She didn't take the bridge. She's going to walk right into the fire." "Are you ready?" Dr. Eris Thorne asked, his voice tight with nerves. Elena looked back at the sprawling mansion, the symbol of everything that had been stolen from her. "I've been ready for 5 years, Eris. Tell the courier to deliver the first set of documents to the press gallery at exactly 8 p.m. tomorrow. I want the journalists reading the truth while Beatrice is still giving her speech." She hung up and walked toward her car. The countdown had reached its final 24 hours. Tomorrow, the world would see Beatrice Vance for exactly what she was, and Elena would finally be the one holding the gavel. The evening arrived with a heavy, oppressive stillness that felt like the breath held before a scream. The Vance estate was a constellation of amber lights against the darkening hills, every window glowing with the performative warmth of a family that was, in reality, rotting from the inside out. Elena Vance stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the damp cobblestones with the precision of a metronome. She wore a dress of midnight silk, simple and sharp, a stark contrast to the sprawling, ornate decadence of the house she had once called home. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of white gardenias and the expensive, metallic tang of high-end catering. Beatrice Vance stood at the center of the ballroom, a glass of vintage champagne held loosely in her hand as she held court. She was draped in diamonds that caught the light with every practiced tilt of her head, but it was the necklace that made Elena's blood turn to ice. It was a teardrop emerald, a Vance heirloom that had belonged to Elena's mother. Beatrice wore it like a trophy, a glistening green reminder of everything she had usurped. "You actually came," Beatrice said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure the nearby circle of socialites heard the condescension. She didn't offer a greeting, only a slow, sweeping look that dismissed Elena's attire as if it were a cheap costume. "I suppose even a nurse knows how to appreciate a bit of culture once a year. Just try not to hover near the buffet, dear. We wouldn't want the guests mistaking you for the help." The women surrounding her tittered, a collective sound of sharpening knives. Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the digital recorder in her clutch, a secret power that made the insult feel as flimsy as paper. She met the older woman's gaze, her expression a mask of calm that seemed to unsettle Beatrice more than an outburst would have. "The house looks beautiful, Beatrice," Elena replied, her voice smooth and pitched for the witnesses. "It's amazing what you can do with a legacy that isn't yours." Beatrice's smile didn't falter, but her grip on the champagne flute tightened until her knuckles turned white. She leaned in, the scent of her cloyingly sweet perfume filling the space between them. "Enjoy the view while you can. By tomorrow, I'm putting this place into a private trust. You won't even be able to see the gates from the road." She turned away before Elena could respond, moving toward the far end of the room where Julian Vance sat in a high-backed velvet chair. He looked diminished, a ghost of the patriarch he had once been, his eyes clouded and wandering. Beside him stood Marcus Vance, looking frantic as he checked his watch every 30 seconds. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, his face pale beneath the tan he'd bought on a recent trip to Macau. Elena moved through the crowd, her presence a ripple in the sea of silk and tuxedos. She found Mrs. Gable near the service entrance, the older woman's face a map of silent stoicism. As Elena passed, the housekeeper leaned in, pretending to adjust a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "The journalists are in the back gallery," Mrs. Gable whispered, her eyes fixed on the center of the room. "They've already started receiving the digital packets. The buzz is starting, Elena. They're confused, but they're staying." "And the speech?" Elena asked. 10 minutes. Beatrice wants the maximum audience for her announcement." Elena nodded, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She retreated to the shadows of the grand staircase, pulling her phone from her bag. A single message glowed on the screen from Eris. The courier confirmed delivery to the editor-in-chief of the Chronicle. "The lead story is being swapped as we speak. When she starts talking, the world starts reading." She looked up to see Marcus cornering his mother near the podium. His gestures were jagged, desperate. He was likely begging for another advance on an inheritance that was currently being liquidated by his own mother's greed. Beatrice dismissed him with a sharp wave of her hand, her face contorting into a mask of disgust before she smoothed it back into the regal expression of a philanthropist. It was a rage-inducing display of coldness, a mother treating her favored son like a persistent insect because he was no longer useful to her image. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, a signal for the main event. A hush fell over the room, the kind of expectant silence that precedes a coronation. Beatrice began to walk toward the small stage, her heels echoing on the polished wood. She stopped by Julian, patting his hand with a theatrical affection that made Elena's stomach turn. She was using a dying man as a prop for her own saintliness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Beatrice began, her voice amplified by the hidden speakers, resonating with a practiced, honeyed warmth. She stood behind the mahogany podium, the Vance crest gleaming beneath the spotlights. "Tonight is not just about the foundation. It is about the future of a name that has stood for integrity for generations." Elena stepped out from the shadows of the staircase, moving slowly toward the center of the room. She was no longer a guest, she was a predator. She saw the flash of several phones in the back of the room. The journalists were looking down, their faces illuminated by the blue light of breaking news alerts. The first wave of the truth had landed. Beatrice took a deep breath, her hand going to the emerald at her throat. She looked out over the crowd, her eyes finding Elena's for a fleeting, triumphant second. She didn't see the confusion starting to spread among the guests in the back rows. She didn't see the way the lead reporter for the city's largest paper was already signaling his cameraman. "I have spent 5 years protecting this family," Beatrice continued, her voice rising with a dramatic flourish. "And tonight, I am proud to announce a new chapter for the Vance legacy, a chapter where we finally cut away the shadows of the past." She paused, waiting for the applause she considered her birthright. Elena reached into her bag and pressed a button on her phone, triggering the final upload to the ballroom's internal Wi-Fi. Beatrice opened her mouth to deliver the final line of her prepared speech, but the words died as the massive projector screen behind her, intended to show a montage of her charity work, flickered to life. It wasn't a picture of a hospital wing. It was a high-resolution scan of a bank transfer dated the day after Elena's mother had died. The room went deathly silent. Beatrice turned, her eyes widening as she saw the document. She looked back at the crowd, her face a sudden, jarring mask of confusion that was rapidly curdling into terror. Elena took a step forward, the light hitting her face. "Go on, Beatrice," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Tell them about the legacy." The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer respectful. It was heavy, suffocating, and punctuated only by the low, mechanical hum of the projector. Beatrice Vance stood frozen at the mahogany lectern, the crimson flush that had defined her triumphant speech draining away. Her skin turned the color of curdled milk, and her perfectly lined lips trembled, losing their sharp contour as her mouth hung slightly agape. The confidence in her eyes, those cold, calculating sapphires, shattered into 1,000 frantic shards as they darted from the high-resolution bank statement on the screen to the horrified faces in the front row. Her throat worked visibly, a frantic, rhythmic pulsing against the high silk of her collar, but no sound escaped the tight, panicked constriction of her chest. She looked suddenly smaller, the expensive fabric of her gown hanging off a frame that seemed to be collapsing from the inside out. Julian Vance sat in the front row, his hand trembling so violently that his crystal glass slipped from his fingers. The sound of it shattering against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot, but he didn't look down. He stared at the screen, his eyes fixed on the date of the transfer, the morning after his first wife's funeral. Beside him, Marcus Vance went ashen, his fingers flying across his phone screen as if he could somehow delete the digital ghost haunting the room. In the back, Dr. Eris Thorne crossed his arms, his professional mask replaced by a look of profound, clinical disgust. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, their trays tilted as they stared at the evidence of a daughter's inheritance being siphoned away before the earth was even packed over the casket. "It's a forgery," Beatrice finally choked out, her voice thin and reedy, a ghost of its former authority. She gripped the edges of the lectern so hard her knuckles turned a ghostly white. She tried to force a laugh, but it came out as a jagged, ugly sound. "Elena is a disturbed girl. She's always been jealous of my position, of the work I've done for this family. This is a digital fabrication, a desperate attempt to—" "The routing numbers are verified, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice cutting through the frantic denial with the precision of a scalpel. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She stepped into the pool of light at the base of the stage, the scent of the funeral lilies that Beatrice had insisted on for the gala suddenly feeling like an indictment. "I didn't just find the statement. I found the authorization log. You used my mother's biometric bypass while she was in a coma. You didn't even wait for her heart to stop before you started moving the Vance legacy into your private offshore accounts." Beatrice's eyes bulged. She looked at Julian, her expression a grotesque mask of pleading. "Julian, darling, you know her. You know how she's always sought attention. I did everything for this family. I saved us from the debt your first wife left behind." "My mother left no debt," Elena countered, pulling a second remote from her pocket. She clicked it and the screen flickered again. This time it wasn't a bank statement. It was a scanned letter, handwritten in a delicate, fading script addressed to Julian. "She left a trust, one you suppressed for 20 years, one that was meant to fund the very clinics you've been donating to for tax breaks." The room erupted into a low, vicious murmur. The socialites who had been nodding along to Beatrice's speech moments ago now pulled their chairs back, creating a physical void around the Vance family table. The air in the room felt cold, the champagne suddenly tasting like vinegar to those who had toasted to a lie. Beatrice lunged forward, reaching for the laptop on the side table, her grace entirely evaporated. She looked like a cornered animal, her hair coming loose from its perfect chignon. "Turn it off." "Security, remove her. She's trespassing." But no security guards moved. They stood by the doors, their eyes fixed on Julian, who had finally stood up. He looked at the woman he had married, the woman who had replaced the mother of his child, and saw a stranger. Elena didn't wait for the shouting to begin. She had seen enough. She watched the color continue to drain from Beatrice's face until she looked like a marble statue of her own greed. The power in the room had shifted, flowing away from the lectern and pooling around the quiet nurse who had dared to remember the truth. "A legacy built on a grave isn't an inheritance, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice echoing one last time through the hall. "It's a crime scene, and the police are already in the foyer." Elena turned her back on the chaos, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble as she walked toward the exit. Behind her, the first sob of Beatrice's genuine terror broke the silence, but Elena didn't look back. She had a different life to start, and for the first time in 20 years, the weight of the Vance name felt light. The air in the grand hall felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by the collective gasp of the city's elite. The silence that followed Elena's declaration was heavy, punctuated only by the low, mechanical hum of the projector that still displayed the damning evidence of Beatrice's decades of theft. Elena stood her ground at the edge of the stage, her shadow stretching long across the polished floor, while the woman who had spent 20 years trying to erase her existence finally began to crumble. Beatrice's skin, usually a porcelain mask of expensive creams and curated arrogance, began to mottle with a sickly, grayish pallor. Her eyes, once sharp and predatory, darted wildly, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks of pure panic as the weight of the room's collective judgment bore down on her. Her mouth, which had spent years hurling insults at those she deemed beneath her, hung open in a jagged, silent O, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that shattered her carefully maintained facade of elegance. The fine lines around her eyes, usually hidden by expertly applied foundation, deepened into crevices of terror, and her posture, once rigid with the pride of a queen, slumped until she looked like a broken doll cast aside in the dirt. She reached for the lectern to steady herself, but her hand missed, her manicured nails scraping against the wood with a sound like a dying animal's claws. "This is a lie," Beatrice finally hissed, though the words lacked their usual venom. She looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, but found only a sea of cold, averted gazes. "Julian, tell them she's unstable. She's always been jealous of what we built." Julian Vance didn't speak. He stood several feet away, his face a mask of profound, agonizing realization. He looked at the screen, then at his wife, then at the daughter he had allowed to be sidelined for a lifetime. His hands shook so violently that his silver-headed cane clattered rhythmically against the marble, a hollow, lonely sound that echoed the heartbeat of a dying legacy. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago, smaller, as if the lies that had propped up his stature had finally dissolved. "The records don't lie, Mother," Marcus Vance said, his voice cutting through the tension with a sudden, sharp clarity. He took a deliberate step away from her, moving toward the center of the room where the board members stood. His eyes, usually clouded by the haze of his secret vices, were now bright with the instinct of a survivor. "I suspected something was wrong with the estate accounts, but I never imagined the scale of this. I can't believe you'd put the Vance name at such risk." Beatrice spun toward her son, her eyes wide with a new kind of betrayal. "Marcus, what are you saying? I did everything for you." "You did it for yourself," Marcus countered, his tone dripping with a rehearsed sense of moral outrage. He turned to the room, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence. "I want it on the record that I had no part in these transactions. I will cooperate fully with any investigation." The room erupted into a low, fierce murmur. The board members, men and women who had sipped Beatrice's vintage champagne and laughed at her cruel jokes just an hour prior, were now huddled in tight circles, their whispers sounding like the rustle of dry leaves. Dr. Thorne stepped forward from the shadows of the wings, his expression one of clinical detachment, as he looked at the woman who had once been his most powerful patron. "The board will be convening an emergency session immediately," Dr. Thorne announced, his voice carrying to the back of the hall. "Beatrice, until the audit is complete and the authorities have finished their inquiry, your access to all Foundation assets is suspended." Elena watched the scene unfold with a calm that felt like armor. She felt the weight of the small, leather-bound diary in her hand, Mrs. Gable's final gift, and knew that the truth was now an unstoppable force. She moved toward the steps of the stage, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to count down the seconds of Beatrice's reign. "You think you've won," Beatrice shrieked, her voice hitting a high, discordant note that made the guests wince. She lunged toward Elena, but Julian stepped between them, his cane held out like a barrier. She recoiled as if he had struck her. "Julian, move, she's taking everything, our home, our name." "It was never ours to begin with," Julian said, his voice a low, broken rasp. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on Elena. "It belonged to the people you stepped on to get here. It belonged to my daughter." Elena stopped at the bottom of the stairs, the scent of the expensive lilies in the foyer drifting in, cloying and funeral-like. She looked at Beatrice one last time, not with anger, but with the cold, clear sight of someone who had finally stepped out of a long shadow. "I'm not taking anything, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice steady and echoing through the hushed hall. "I'm simply returning what was stolen. The house, the accounts, the legacy, they've already been placed under a legal freeze. You'll find that the locks at the estate have already been changed." Beatrice let out a strangled sound, a mix of a sob and a scream, as two uniformed officers appeared in the grand arched doorway. The guests parted like a receding tide, leaving her standing alone in the center of the room, a fallen queen in a stained gown. Elena didn't stay to watch the handcuffs click into place. She turned and walked toward the exit, her heart light for the first time in decades. She passed Mrs. Gable, who stood near the doors, a small, knowing smile touching the older woman's lips. As Elena stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy oak doors of the hall groaned shut behind her, sealing the chaos inside. The street was quiet, the city lights shimmering on the wet pavement. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of rain and freedom. Behind her, the Vance name was a ruin, but ahead of her, the path was finally clear. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the key to the small apartment she had kept in secret, a place that was entirely hers. She started her car, the engines purr a low, comforting growl. As she pulled away from the curb, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the rearview mirror. She didn't see the shy, overlooked nurse anymore. She saw a woman who had faced the fire and come out forged in steel. The reckoning was over, but the silence that followed was far from empty. It was the sound of a new beginning, and for Elena, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She drove into the night, leaving the ghosts of the Vance legacy to haunt the woman who had traded her soul for a title that no longer existed. 6 months had passed since the gilded gates of the Vance estate had swung shut for the last time. Elena Vance stood by the window of her new office at the St. Jude's Rehabilitation Wing, watching the autumn leaves dance across the pavement. The air in the room smelled of fresh linen and the faint, calming scent of eucalyptus, a far cry from the suffocating heaviness of lilies and old secrets that had defined her former life. She adjusted the stethoscope around her neck, its cool metal a grounding weight against her scrubs. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the department head, a position earned not through a name, but through the sheer, unrelenting competence she had once been forced to hide. The morning was quiet until a sharp, rhythmic tapping echoed from the doorway. Elena didn't need to turn around to know the sound of desperation masked as authority. "I was told I wouldn't have to wait," a voice snapped. It was a voice that used to command boardrooms, now thin and brittle. Elena turned slowly. Beatrice Vance stood in the entrance, clutching a knockoff designer handbag as if it were a shield. Her coat was a shade of beige that had seen too many seasons, the hem frayed where it had caught on something sharp. The woman who had once spent thousands on a single weekend in Aspen now looked like a ghost haunting her own wardrobe. The arrogance remained in the tilt of her chin, but the fire in her eyes had been replaced by a flickering, frantic sort of hunger. "The clinic opens at 8, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice level and devoid of the tremors that used to plague her. "You're early. I have an appointment for my checkup, and I expect the professional courtesy my family name deserves." Beatrice stepped into the room, her nose wrinkling at the modest but clean surroundings. "This place is quaint. I suppose it's all you could manage with your little settlement." Elena leaned against her desk, unmoved. "The settlement paid for the wing, the equipment, and the staff. It also paid for your current housing, if I recall the legal terms correctly." Beatrice's face tightened, the skin pulling over her cheekbones. The public humiliation of the audit had stripped her of the mansion, the cars, and the social standing she breathed like oxygen. Now she lived in a one-bedroom apartment overlooking a bus depot, surviving on a court-mandated stipend that Elena personally authorized. "It's a hovel," Beatrice hissed, moving closer. "The pipes rattle all night. And the neighbors, they're the kind of people who leave their trash in the hallways. You did this on purpose. You wanted to see me crawl. I wanted you to see the world as it actually is," Elena replied. She picked up a chart, flipping through the pages. "How is Marcus Vance? I heard the creditors finally caught up with him in Vegas." Beatrice flinched. The mention of her favored son was a physical blow. Marcus had vanished 2 months ago, leaving behind a trail of gambling debts that had wiped out the last of Beatrice's hidden jewelry. "He's traveling. He'll be back once his investments mature." It was a pathetic lie, and they both knew it. The silence that followed was filled only with the hum of the building's ventilation. Elena felt a pang of something that wasn't quite pity, but a hollow recognition of the waste. All that cruelty, all those years of looking down on others, and it had ended in a cramped apartment with rattling pipes. "Julian Vance asked about you yesterday," Elena said softly. Beatrice's expression shifted, a momentary crack in the mask. "And he didn't remember the trial, or the money. He just asked why the house was so quiet." The cost of the war sat between them, heavy and immovable. Julian was safe in a high-end care facility, his mind slipping further into the fog of dementia every day. He was the only thing Elena had lost that she truly mourned, the father she had tried to save, who now looked at her with the blank kindness of a stranger. She had won the empire, but she had lost the man. Beatrice let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "Well, at least he spared the sight of you playing at being a savior." She reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled bill. "I need an advance on next month's allowance. The heating bill was unexpected." Elena looked at the paper, then back at the woman who had once poured wine over her dress just to watch her cry. She reached into her drawer, pulled out a checkbook, and wrote a figure that would cover the heat but nothing more. No luxuries, no status, just survival. "This is the last time, Beatrice," Elena said, handing over the check. "The terms are final." Beatrice snatched the paper, her fingers trembling. She didn't say thank you. She couldn't. She turned on her heel, her cheap heels clicking hollowly on the linoleum as she retreated toward the exit. Elena walked back to the window. In the distance, the old Vance estate was being converted into a public park, the stone walls being torn down to let the light in. She had her justice, her career, and her freedom. But as she watched the small, retreating figure of the woman who had once been her tormentor, Elena realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the ruin she had left behind. It was the fact that she could finally breathe in the silence, while Beatrice was still suffocating in the noise of a life that no longer existed. Elena turned back to her desk, picked up her next patient's file, and stepped into the hall, leaving the ghosts to finish their own fading stories.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.